You are listening to American Ambassadors Live, the podcast on international affairs sponsored by the Council of American Ambassadors in Washington, D.C. The Council is the association of non-career U.S. ambassadors who have represented America under presidents from John F. Kennedy through Donald Trump.
Our guest today is Ambassador John Emerson, who represented the United States in Germany from 2013 to 2017. He's now chair of the American Council on Germany, vice chair of Capital Group International, and on the board of the German Marshal Fund. Thanks for joining us, John.
Hey, thanks a lot, Jim. Great to be with you.
We want to talk today about Germany, particularly in relation to Putin's war in Ukraine. Obviously, it's very controversial in Europe in some ways, the way it's controversial in the United States. But on the other hand, we've seen basically unity in the last 6 months within Europe and within NATO. So give us the big picture of where is Germany as it looks at the war in Ukraine, both from the political leadership point of view, but also from the public point of view.
Well, just to really step back, it's important to understand that Germany's relationship with Russia over the last 40, 50 years has been somewhat schizophrenic. For a couple of reasons. Number one, obviously, they're very close geographically to Russia. Secondly, there's still a bit of hangover guilt in Germany from 20 million Russians killed during World War II. It was actually about 40 million Russians killed, but Stalin, was responsible for about half of that. There's a bit of admiration for the Russian spirit, the Russian soul, and interestingly enough, and this sort of pertains to the current situation, the incredible ability of the Russian people to endure suffering for a long period of time. And you get some admiration from Germans about that. You also have the reality that up until the fall of the wall, if you think about, just generationally, just as you had so many Germans in the West who became super close to America, you came in, you taught us about democracy, you taught us about a free press, you rebuilt us, and you are our friend and ally. And you had Germans growing up with the sons and daughters of the 300,000 plus servicemen and women that at any given point of time during the Cold War were serving in Germany, intermarriage between Germans and Americans. Virtually any German you met who went on to university did some time in the United States, either at high school level or university level on an exchange program, deep relationships there. Well, a third of the country geographically and a quarter of the country population-wise had the same relationship with Russia and Russians because they grew up in the former GDR, the former East Germany. And then you overlay on top of that two particular things. Number one, the reality that when Willy Brandt was chancellor, the Social Democratic Party in particular, and obviously Germany in general, embarked on the policy of Ostpolitik, which was during the height of the Cold War. How can we build a better sort of relationship, more of a conversational relationship, more engagement with Russia? Because, just directionally, the way the Cold War was headed was not looking very positive if you want to think about concern about peace in Europe. And this became a fundamental tenet of German foreign policy, engagement with Russia, trying to build a deeper and stronger understanding and relationship with Russia. And that, of course, accelerated after the fall of the wall. And then finally, you had the German economic model. And the German economic model, which worked really well for them in the last 50 years, but particularly in the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic, wonder of what happened with Germany, was America defends us, Russia sells us cheap energy, and we build great stuff that we sell to Chinese and other people around the world. So you have all that dynamic, which led to both caution when it came to dealing with Russia militarily. As an example, during the entire Ukraine war process, which started back in 2014, Angela Merkel was adamant that we in the West should not be arming Ukraine with offensive lethal weapons, because she believed that if we did that, it'd be like a poker game where Putin would see you and raise you, and it would be a never-ending, accelerating process of bloodshed and armed conflict that Russia would always have the upper hand on, because she, of course, knew that, as we've seen today, NATO and the United States would have no interest in engaging in a military conflict directly with Russia over Ukraine. And so just like very, very sensitive, careful, what have you, about that whole process. So that was sort of the mindset in Germany. I'm part of the Munich Security Conference. I have been since 2013, and I'm now on the board of the American Friends of the Munich Security Conference. And I was there, 4 days before this whole thing started. And I would say that, notwithstanding the intelligence that that President Biden was sharing with our friends and allies, which was, and by the way, with the press, I mean, it was widely reported at Munich,
Right.
Notwithstanding the commentary from the speech by Zelensky, the commentary from Ukrainians, from Poles in particular, Polish leadership who were at the Munich Security Conference saying, this is happening, you got to take it seriously, notwithstanding the admonitions from the US government. I bet you 50% of the people in that hall at the Munich Security Conference, which is much broader than Germany, actually didn't believe that Putin would invade. They thought it made no sense, which on many levels it didn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But if you put yourself in Vladimir Putin's head and you believe that Ukraine isn't an independent country at all and really is part of Russia, and part of your job, your legacy is going to be to restore the greatness of Russia, maybe it would make sense. Still don't think it did, but in any event, they didn't think it made sense. They thought if Putin did anything, it would just be to solidify the strength in the Donbass and maybe go for a land bridge between Russia and Crimea. Didn't think it would be a full-scale invasion, all the way up until 3 days later when, bam, he came in with his full-scale invasion. And by the way, when it came to American intelligence, I can't tell you the number of people who said to me, oh yeah, we hear that you guys are saying that. Tell us again about weapons of mass destruction. Tell us again about how long Kabul is going to hold out before the Taliban take over. So we had a couple of pretty high visibility failures of American intelligence that undercut the credibility of what we were saying. So when this happened, from a political standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, from the standpoint of a cultural echo of people in Germany kind of remembering, maybe not in their own heads because they were too young, but remembering culturally hundreds of years of war on European soil, when those Russian tanks came rolling into eastern Ukraine, it was a shock. It was a shock to the German people. And the proof of that is that, and I'll end here and we can, continue whichever direction you want to take this.
Sure.
The proof of that was that 3 days after the invasion, and by the way, I think we need to be thinking of February 24th as the end of the post-Cold War era.
For sure.
We don't know what this new era is, but it is a new era. This isn't like a 6-month, 18-month, 24-month hiatus. This is a new era that we are entering into. But in any event, that 3 or 4 days after that invasion, Olaf Scholz, the leader of the Social Democratic Party, the party of Ostpolitik, and the new chancellor of Germany, gave his extraordinary Zeitenwende speech in the Bundestag, the German parliament, where basically he jettisoned what had been 40, 50 years of sacred cows of German foreign policy as it related to Russia. Yes, we are going to meet our 2% NATO spending number, and we're going to put that in the Constitution so people can't back up. Yes, we're going to change our rules as it relates to sending military equipment, offensive military equipment, into conflict zones. We're going to let other countries do that with equipment that Germany either is providing or has provided, and we're going to do it directly ourselves. And we are going to immediately embark on an aggressive program to begin to wean ourselves from dependence on Russian energy. I mean, this was an extraordinary shift. And by the way, we're going to spend $100 billion to upgrade the German military, which had been woefully underfunded. And by the way, we're going to stop Nord Stream 2, which was all they needed to do was turn a key and turn it on. So this was a pretty extraordinary shift in a very quick period of time, which I think is indicative of the kind of shock that this invasion created for Germany and for the German people and for the German government.
Well, let me ask you this in terms of take us back like maybe a couple of years or maybe a couple of months. Is you set the scene for the history of the decades of German-Russian relationship. Invasion takes place. The chancellor flips on a dime. Were there debates within the German government, within German politics over the last few years, particularly since 2014? I mean, it's been pretty clear for a while that Putin isn't the nicest guy in the world. Had there been debates over this period of time in Germany where some people said we got to toughen up and some people said, no, we got to stick with what we have? How did that play in the last couple of years?
Absolutely. I mean, the two areas of debate, and we did this more on a person-to-person, government-to-government level, but also would mention it in speeches. The Trump administration took it to, a hugely visible level, almost creating the impression that this was the only thing that mattered in the relationship. But it was the Obama administration in 2014 at the NATO summit in Wales that got Germany to agree to the 2% NATO spending. Now, by the way, that wasn't tomorrow. We're up at 2% of GDP, and it was by 2024. So over a 10-year period of time to grow to that point. And by the way, during the last 4 years of, or last 3 years of Obama, they were moving in that direction. They weren't there yet. They had a long way to go. And every bilateral meeting that I was in with the president and the Chancellor Merkel, and this ambassador, as you know, you're in all of those. Obama raised this. Merkel acknowledged it. Pushed back a little because she said, well, our economy is growing, so we're spending more. Maybe the percent isn't moving as quickly as you'd like. I mean, there is a little bit of hedging there. And the second thing we pushed on very hard was their energy dependence on Russia. Mm-hmm. And this is interesting. So, but by the way, what party was strongest in effect opposing Germany's energy dependence on Russia? The Greens. First of all, they don't like fossil fuels, right? So, and secondly, on a human rights standpoint, the Greens are tougher on Russia and on China, or have been at least in recent times, than even the CDU, which is Merkel's party, sort of the more conservative. What you would think of as, I'd say the CDU is more like a center-right party. Mm-hmm. So you think about the sort of the Bush foreign policies. That would be more in line, and even kind of the Clinton Obama foreign policies, probably closer to where the CDU was than either where the left, certainly not where the left wing of the Democratic Party is, or the far right of the Republican Party. But that's sort of their politics. But in any event, the Greens were tougher than they were on this. We were flatly opposed to Nord Stream 2. And I had conversations with Merkel about it. I was like, hey, in the middle of this Ukraine situation, how can you guys be moving down the road of Nord Stream 2 when if gas is coming into Germany and Northern Europe through that pipeline, it gives Russia an ability to cut off the gas coming through the Ukrainian pipeline, which Ukraine depended on for, to the tune of a couple $2 billion a month of transit fees from Russia. And, just from a geopolitical standpoint, that doesn't make sense. And her answer was, well, we're getting commitments from the Russians, they won't do that. We would obviously respond aggressively if they did. And by the way, we're not going to be that dependent on Russian oil and gas because we're building regasification facilities for liquefied natural gas in Wilhelmshaven and Bremerhaven, two of the ports. One is on, ports on the North Sea. Well, I had the day after the Munich Security Conference, I had breakfast with Wolfgang Schmidt, who is the chief of staff to Olaf Scholz, was then the relatively new, chief of staff, head of the chancellery. It's a big job to this chancellor. And I asked him about that. I said, by the way, our entire conversation and lunch, the premise was that in response to sanctions that will be imposed, Russia will probably cut off the oil and gas. So it's like, are you guys prepared for this? Right. And he said, they're obviously worried about it. They're obviously taking steps to do it. And by the way, between 2014, when Russia started this war, and February 24th of this year,
Yeah.
Germany went from 35% dependency on Russian gas to 55% dependency on Russian gas. So I asked him about it. I said, well, at least you've got those LNG regasification plants. He goes, actually not. They stopped construction on those back in 2018. Of course, I was no longer ambassador then.
Right.
I was like, and he goes, we're obviously back at that, but it's another 12 to 18 months before we get those online. That's why you read about Germany, trying to find these floating LNG facilities that they can bring in there. And so the point is, yes, there were debates within the government, but not really. You know why? Because I think that economic model of America protects us, Russia sells us cheap energy, and we make great stuff that we sell to the rest of the world was working pretty well for him. And I do think that it was almost because it seemed so irrational, and obviously, Germany is very pragmatic, and rational in a sense country. It seemed so irrational that Russia would jeopardize all of that for this when it was clear Ukraine was never going to join.
Let me ask you a question along that line, because
go ahead.
Because in 2014, when they invaded Crimea and invaded Donbass, Eastern Ukraine, there was an attempt by some sanctions and some denunciation, which some people at the time, not in the Obama administration, I don't think, but maybe they did, and I just didn't hear about them, thought were too weak, and we hadn't been strong enough.
Well, let me tell you about that. First of all, we were happy to get them. And Angela Merkel deserves credit for literally doing, remember old Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy in the Mideast?
Yeah.
She was basically doing that to all the member states in the EU to try to get everybody together. I mean, Italy wasn't all that excited about it at that time. Greece wasn't all that excited about it at this time on imposing sanctions. They're like, wait a minute, we got a good economic thing going here. We don't want to jeopardize that. Hungary, Austria gets 80, Germany had 50%, Austria 80% dependency on Russian gas. And so consequently, she worked really, really hard to get any agreement at the EU level on sanctions. And from the Obama administration, we wanted to do more, and we did do more, but we also didn't want to have too big a gap between what Europe did on the one hand and what we were doing on the other hand, because we didn't want Putin to say, this is just some American anti-Russia thing.
Right.
We wanted to say the world is against what you're doing here. And honestly, we would not have been able to close the deal with the EU on sanctions, but for the shooting down of MH17, the Malaysian commercial airliner that was shot down over Ukraine. When that happened, within a matter of 72 hours, we got the sanctions imposed by the EU. And I mean, but that's how tough it was at that point in time. That's why they weren't much stronger than what some people were advocating, like John McCain, as an example.
Right. I guess the question I'm asking, though, is really, I want to come back to sort of German policy and German politics and German perception. It sounds like what you're saying is the 2014 invasion did not shake Germany out of its decades-long, we got to get along with Russia, and Russia will like to get along with us.
I would say it was concerning to many in the German government. It was concerning to Angela Merkel. There was no need to get Germany on board with the idea of imposing wide range of sanctions on Russia for this behavior. But in terms of the general public, the reaction that people have now, where many people we know in Germany literally articulate a concern about would there be a nuclear attack on Germany by Russia, none of that happened for sure.
And again, help me understand this in terms of how Germans look at Russia and Ukraine. I mean, 2014 was an invasion of Ukraine. It did not look like an invasion to take over the government. Is that the distinction? I mean, they both were invasions.
Well, think about it. Just look at, and this is also gives you from Putin's standpoint in terms of of the timing and why he probably thought he could get away with this. Look at what happened with Chechnya. Look what happened with Georgia. look, let's go back to 56 in Hungary or 68 in the Czechoslovakia, I guess, in those days.
Right.
Russia would do these things, or first the Soviet Union, and then Russia would have these kinds of invasions. The West would be shocked and outraged. And within a year or two, we're back to business as usual. And so I think there was shock and outrage, but I guarantee you there was also, Merkel was dealing with pressure from many in the German business community about, hey, let's not screw this up. This is a good thing. And I do think there were some people, well, Crimea used to be part of Russia. Khrushchev sort of, gave it back to Ukraine. Right. He had Ukrainian roots. Was that, and then the little green men in the Donbass. This is why I think many were shocked that Putin went with a full-scale invasion. Let's decapitate the government and take over the country, because they thought if I actually thought this too, if he went with little green men and cyber attacks and that kind of thing, where the Europeans would say, well, is that really invasion? Is that not an invasion? There would have been arguments within the alliance. Jake Sullivan made clear, one person coming over the border, that constitutes an invasion. We're imposing this whole regimen of sanctions. Believe me, there would have been lots of arguments about that. They would have had a hard time holding that together. So a lot of people thought that would be Putin's approach. And I think the same thing, there was sort of within Germany, within the government, we had no problems. They were completely on board with the imposing sanction. Within the German public, this absolutely did not have the little green men, the cyber attacks, the taking over of Crimea like that, which, by the way, you had a whole lot of Russian people who identified as much as with Russia as they did with Ukraine in some of those regions, which I think also led to Putin's miscalculation about how his ultimate invasion would be received by the Ukrainian people. But in any event, you had a lot of Germans that were, it didn't have the shock effect as massive number of tanks rolling over, the border onto Ukrainian soil. And it also didn't have the shock effect of Ukrainians, who, of course, many Europeans see as European, coming over as refugees. Very, very different dynamic. You didn't really have that in 2014.
No, that makes sense. So in that case, when the chancellor flipped the country's policy, was he following the politics or leading the politics?
He was leading the politics, but I will tell you, the only parties in the Bundestag who were against it were Die Linke, which has about 8 or 9% of the Bundestag, and they are the former Communist Party of East Germany, of the GDR, effectively, and AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, the xenophobic right-wing, far right-wing party in Germany that also had about 8-9% of the Bundestag, and whose activities are largely funded by Russia, and so those guys were against. I meant 80% of the Bundestag, the CDU, the Social Democrats, the Greens, the Free Democrats were all 100% foursquare for it. Standing ovation time. We embrace this. That's the kind of shock that this invasion created within German politics and within German society. So Scholz was leading the politics. He definitely went, if he were to sort of had gone out and had a bunch of debates within, the German, well, do we really want to do that? Do we really, I'm not so sure, blah, blah, blah. When he went in there, took the bull by the horns, everybody would sort of stand up and cheer. Yeah, leadership, we're going. And remember the complaint, irony is Scholz ran as sort of a Merkel 2.0, even though he was from a different party. I'm experienced, I'm steady, I'm pragmatic, I'm not, not this big emotional firebrand, it's going to be a steady continuation of Merkel's policies. Well, then the criticism of Scholz was, hey, we don't hear from the guy, he's a little too quiet. So all of a sudden he comes out and takes that leadership role. People were sort of hoping for that. So I think I think he was leading the politics, but the politics was ready to be there. It wasn't like he's here and the politics is here. It was more he's here and the politics was definitely moving in that direction. And,
yeah. Let me ask you one more question related to Ukraine war specifically, and then I want to switch over to energy more generally. So is that public support and political support holding up 6 months later after the shock and awe? is not on television anymore, or is it on television all the time still in Germany, just not in the United States?
It's people are aware of it. It's still on television, maybe not as much as obviously what we saw in the opening days of this invasion, for sure. But it's present. People think about it. People still talk about their plan B. What do we do if this thing comes further east? I think that bell cannot be unrung. But Putin's betting, and he knows Germany well. Don't forget, he was the KGB guy in East Germany during the fall of the wall, which is one reason why he's so, he has PTSD over the idea of a popular revolution against autocratic rule. Because he was sitting there burning documents and shredding documents in the consulate in Dresden when this was all going on, and being told by the Soviet government, "You're on your own, pal." So this is part of Putin's psyche to kind of keep in mind. But in any event, I think the German public, you have there's definitely there always is sort of a group of people in Germany, not a group, but I mean a significant percentage of the population, that their attitude will be, can't we get back to normal? This is going to be tough. We've got, oh my gosh, we're suffering now from layoffs because there isn't enough gas for industrial purposes. We're suffering from, we're moving into winter. We're worried about being cold in winter because most of the gas is used for home heating in Germany. And Vladimir Putin's bet. Remember the comment I said about Germans being very, sort of inspired by the Russian capacity for enduring suffering? His bet is he can wait them out. His bet is, I can take sanctions and all the pain that's going to, create in Russian society. Our people will be able to handle that. The fat and happy and lazy, Westerners, they're not going to be able to handle that. They're not going to be able to take it. And at some point, that support is going to crumble. That's his bet.
What's
and
your
I
view?
would say my bet is the support will stay there. But I would also say that, the jury is still out. Let's see where we are in January, February. I'll also say that if we do get through that, then Putin's in trouble. Because if you talk to your predecessor and friend, Mark Gittenstein, the ambassador to the EU, he will go on and on about the export controls that have been imposed as part of these sanctions by Europe, and how devastating that will be to Russia's industrial capacity and their ability to rebuild their military, because they depend so much on the technology that they imported from Europe for those things. And that'll start really taking a toll as we move into next summer and fall. And by then, Germany's ability to replenish, gas from other sources or whatever will be much stronger than it is. So I think that this next 6 months will be a very, very interesting time. And we'll for sure know the answer to that question you asked.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about the efforts on energy. I mean, energy dependence is sort of part of the problem, and reducing it obviously is a big part of the solution. What is the current situation, and how do you see that playing out really over the next couple of years? Because they're not going to get dramatically independent of Russian energy for years, right?
Well, you got three things going on here simultaneously. Okay, one is the fact that most of their home heating system is natural gas dependent. That they, with the Energiewende, which is when after Fukushima in Japan, Merkel made this announcement that we're going to wean ourselves from nuclear. It was a smart political move to kind of, the Greens were on the ascendancy. It sort of took one of their big arguments away from them. I'm not so sure it was a smart move from an energy diversification standpoint, but in any event, and we're going to move towards, renewables, but they saw natural gas as a transition fuel in the move to renewables, but away from coal and even oil from that standpoint. So that was in part, the increase of dependence on natural gas. So the first question is alternative sources of energy or alternative replacement of natural gas. Now they're now back down to that 35% level. So they were at 35% in 2014, went up to when by the time the invasion started, 55% using Russian gas. They're back down to 35%. Yes, it is more expensive, et cetera. By the end of next year, maybe even, but certainly by the beginning of winter next year, they will have in place these regasification facilities. I think they're now building at least 2 of them. And so the ability to take, yes, more expensive, whatever, but liquefied natural gas, and they're repurposing the gas lines to obviously be able to take it there as opposed to just coming from Russia. They will be in a position where they're able to reduce that dependency, substantially. So that's point, not entirely, but substantially. So there'll still be some pain, but that's moving in the right direction. So the real pain point is going to be the next 6 to 9 months. Russia's proven just this week when they shut down Nord Stream 1, just how Germany gets most of its gas from Russia for maintenance purposes, definitely proving their ability to do that kind of thing and sort of foreshadowing a complete shutdown at some point in time. Don't forget on that end, parenthetically, it is very important for Russia, and has been for a while, to demonstrate that it can be a reliable provider of energy to its customer nations, regardless of what else is happening in the world. Don't forget, during this war, the gas flows are still happening through Ukraine. Russia's still paying Ukraine $1 billion a month in transit fees. So, I mean, that there's a price to be paid for Putin. Maybe he says, okay, we're never going to have the same relationship with Germany but there are other countries that we may, and don't forget, there's a workaround for Austria. There's a workaround for Hungary in terms of even the ban on Russian oil and gas, because they're so dependent on it. EU member states, he doesn't want to create, and even as they repurpose the gas lines, it's going to take a couple of years, to China or to India, he wants to send a message to them, regardless of what's happening geopolitically, we are a reliable provider of energy. So it's not quite so easy from his standpoint as you think, just, hey, let's screw the Germans, let's turn this thing off right away. But in any event, he's got the power to do it, and he's demonstrating that. So it's still going to be a little bit dicey, but they're making that transition so they can get liquefied natural gas. There's also talk about a pipeline coming from Portugal through Spain and up into Germany. That way, that's going to take 2 to 3 years to build. Right. So from that standpoint, a couple of years. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is the move towards renewables. Germany's done a great job. You fly over Germany and you just see windmills everywhere, particularly in the north. When you get a lot of wind, you see a lot of the windmills. What's the problem with windmills? The problem with windmills is if the wind's not blowing, you're not creating energy. And we don't have the battery storage capabilities to you did. And while Germany's been building a lot of windmills, there have been objections on the ground from people who don't want the high tension wires going from north to south to the industrial part of Germany and Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria in particular, because they look ugly, and who wants big power lines going through? So there's been a lot of NIMBYism, not in my backyard, about, yeah, it's great you got these windmills, you ain't going to put those power lines on. So now, as a result of what's happened in this sort of need to be more energy independent, they're calling the power lines Patriot lines or freedom lines.
Oh, wow.
And trying to change the optics of, you want these freedom lines so we can marry. So but the point is, you're going to see, both in terms of money and in terms of delivery capabilities, an increase in the focus on renewables and what they're able to do with renewables. That's going to be accelerated. And the third point is nuclear. So Merkel said, we're done with nuclear. Germany had 6 nuclear power plants. 3 of them have already been decommissioned. 3 of them were scheduled to be decommissioned at the end of this year. Every conversation I have with a leader in the Germany government, I go, what are you guys thinking in not extending that on the 3 that are happening? Well, we don't have the training, it's expensive. We get our, we need to replace the uranium rods. We get them from Russia. Well, guess what? The United States doesn't get its from Russia. I guarantee you can buy them elsewhere. Guess what? That's a money problem. You can hire trained people, because for 10 years, people haven't been going into that technology. A lot of people in France that know how to do this. A lot of people in other countries know how to do this.
So what's the real explanation of why they're not?
The greens.
Okay.
It is an absolute, well,
Right.
and I think in part, we're on this path. We don't want to do it. It's going to be more money. But fundamentally, this is a existential issue for the Greens. They were formed as the anti-nuke party. But now Energy Minister Habeck has changed his tune on this and said, well, you know what? We should probably start thinking about extending this for a couple of years until we get to this point. Now, the nuclear doesn't really replace gas, because nuclear creates electricity, which really isn't used for home heating. And it's not used as much for industrial purposes, like the chemical companies use gas both as a resource and to fire the furnaces and all that. But you keep the nuclear going, you don't have to burn as much coal. It's cheap, it's clean, and maybe you can expand. Maybe there are areas where you can replace some of what gas does with electricity. And so it really does make sense. I bet you that at the end of the day, they do end up pushing off the decommissioning of these plants. And by the way, you're seeing that here in California, which was also sort of in Diablo Canyon. That plant's supposed to be decommissioned. They're pushing that off. I think more and more people are seeing nuclear as a potential solution to the climate change crisis that we're facing.
Let me ask you two questions related to that. One is back on the power lines and the NIMBYism and people not wanting power lines. Why don't they underground them?
Pretty damn expensive. And then you're digging up, you could, but, and it takes a lot longer. It just takes a lot longer.
No, I understand. The reason I asked the question is many years ago, the former Austrian economics minister told me about how they undergrounded power lines in Austria over about a 10-year period. And it was an inspiration for me in terms of what we should be doing in the United States when we have what we have going on, at least in the Washington area, about every week. A mini tornado blows through College Park and takes down the power lines. And New York,
we have that in California. The power lines fall down with wind and they create wildfires.
Exactly.
100%.
New York City undergrounded their electric wires in the 1890s. So anyway, I'm just curious why they were doing
Good
that.
Foresight. I don't know the answer to that. I'm just assuming cost and time. But hey, I'll raise the issue.
No, it is. It's definitely cost. It's definitely cost. But there's a lot of value to it, and particularly
a lot of value
on this issue that you're raising.
But you might say, there's a lot of value to doing it in over a forested area where you could have forest fires with increasing drought, which Europe clearly experienced this summer. Right. There's a lot of value if you're talking about an urban area. I don't know if it's value if you're talking about 200 kilometers of farmland.
No, I understand, but if you just
kind of
if you can't get the electricity from north to south, otherwise. So I was just curious about that.
That's a good question. That's a good point. When I do these little panels and stuff over there, I'll raise it.
Second question, more technical along that line, is on the nuclear and electricity. To what extent is Germany moving to electrify its transportation system? Its electric.
Its transportation system is electrified.
No, cars.
Oh, big time. Tesla's now got a huge plant over there. If you, I participate in this conference that I'm actually going to in 3 weeks up at Schloss Elmau in Bavaria, which is where we had the G7 when I was ambassador in 2015, and they just had the G7 again this past summer. And it's about a conference with probably 200 business leaders in Germany, and the heads of the auto companies are always there. And they're all investing substantially in transition to electrical. And I think they all recognize they're a little bit behind the eight ball. BMW got out there. I remember my first year back there, BMW was unleashing its new e-cars. And the problem with them was they didn't look like BMWs. They were like very boxy and sort of, if you were, kind of, they look cool from an environmental standpoint, but they didn't look cool from a, whatever they call it, the, best driving machine in the world or whatever. And so whatever their ad, I forget what their ad tagline is, but in any event, Now they're repurposing them. They're making them look sexier, so they can go and sell. You can't go to a German airport without a BMW electric car sitting right in the middle of the terminal.
Gotcha.
You know what I mean? And Daimler is a flat out moving to electrical. VW, their plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee, is going to be all electrical, obviously to help service the U.S.
Right.
Environment. But they're moving very, very far to whether they've got, what California did on 2035
Right.
or, I honestly don't know what Germany has passed in that regard, but I think it's of that order of magnitude.
Well, I was raising in the context of demand for electricity because.
Yeah. Well, by the way, here's the other question, and this to me is relates to the nuclear issue as well. So listen to this. In California, where I am right now, 2 days ago, we're in the midst of a big heat wave here in Southern California, and literally there was some announcement. If you have electrical vehicles, please, don't charge them for a week or so because there's going to be so much demand on electricity from air conditioning.
I'm sure.
So it's not. None of this is easy, and the thing to keep in mind with electrical vehicles are great, but how's that electricity generated?
Right.
If it's generated from coal-fired plants,
right. No, absolutely.
maybe it's not so great.
No, absolutely.
So,
Everybody's got that issue.
All of this has to happen. I mean, believe me, I'm not an expert in these areas, and I'm sure someone who is could poke lots of holes in what I'm saying here. But in general, all of this has to be dealt with, simultaneously.
Absolutely. One last question. How does all this affect the European relationship with China?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So China's, and what's really interesting is the Chinese relationship with Russia during all this too.
Right.
So, China has for a long time been trying to strengthen its commercial and economic ties to Europe. Audi has 9 factories over there. Daimler is, or now Daimler's called Mercedes. Mercedes is moving in, building a lot of factories there. I mean, China is the biggest trading partner of Germany. It's the biggest trading partner of Ukraine. So China has really been trying to deepen its relationship with Europe, and at the same time say, don't be like those Americans. Don't do this decoupling thing that the Americans seem to be headed towards, and trying to separate Europe from the United States geopolitically, economically, and every otherly. Because that's very much in their geostrategic interest, at least for the next 5 years or so. At some point, China will get to a point where they've, their technology and subsidization stuff, they can then compete head to head with these European companies. But right now, they need them. They need them badly. And it's a huge priority for them. So, and Europe selling stuff to China. So there are two dynamics here. On the Chinese side, it's interesting that notwithstanding Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping's, pronouncements
Right.
on the eve of the Winter Olympics in Beijing of a partnership without limits, there apparently are limits to this, because China has given lip service to Russia's point of view in the Ukraine war, but is not helping them militarily, is not helping them from a technological standpoint. Sure, they're buying, grain, and they're buying gas and oil from Russia, but believe me, they're buying them at fire sale prices. And so they're being very careful not to run afoul of the sanctions regimen and not to jeopardize the European, investments in China by appearing to be too engaged on Vladimir Putin's side in this war in Ukraine. So that's interesting. That's right. On the European side, there's a lot of conversation, not any action yet, but a lot of conversation about, whoa, do we really want to get ourselves in a place where 5 to 10 years from now, we're as dependent on China for commercial reasons as we have been on Russia for energy? And I'll give you an example. If that both, and I confirmed this with these companies, VW and Mercedes, each of them get more than half of their profits come from their business with China. If they were to get rid of their business with China, their profitability would drop dramatically. So, I mean, they're not about to cut that off right now, but there's sort of a recognition of, wow, are we going to get too dependent on it? So no action yet, but at least the conversation is taking place.
So in a way, the strategy that Germany had with Russia of economic interdependence promoting peace, economic independence with China, maybe promoting peace. Is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, I think that's a fair analogy.
Ambassador Emerson, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ambassador Rosapepe. It's great to see you as always.
This has been the American Ambassadors Live podcast. To hear more from us, subscribe to the American Ambassadors Live podcast and leave us a review. Tweet us your thoughts on this week's episode and tag us at AMER Ambassadors using the hashtag AmbassadorsLive.